There's a quiet rule hidden beneath centuries of thought. Speak like a man if you want to be taken seriously. Be still. Be sharp. Be distant, but never too soft, never too raw. And above, I'll never speak from your body. Because if you do, they'll say it isn't knowledge. They'll say it's just a feeling. Philosophy has always prided itself on asking hard questions. But when it came to women, it took a shortcut. Turned them into symbols of chaos, beauty, temptation, fragility. It named them, diagnosed them, dissected them, but it rarely listened. What if the absence of the feminine in philosophy isn't a gap but a deliberate silence? What if she wasn't missing, just mistranslated? And what if the real reason she was excluded wasn't because she lacked reason, but because her presence made the system tremble? This video is not about adding women to old conversations. It's about exposing the conversations that were never real to begin with. It's about the thinkers who wrote her out, the structures that feared her, and the voices that are now returning, not to fit in, but to rebuild the meaning of thought itself. If you've ever felt like your truth didn't fit the language they gave you, stay. You're not broken. You're just not speaking in exile anymore. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's free and it tells the algorithm that voices like yours matter too. Some women live their entire lives being watched, but never truly seen. Not by strangers, not by the people they love, and certainly not by the systems that claim to define them. For centuries, philosophy didn't try to understand women. It tried to manage them. It's not as subjects, but as symbols flattened into metaphors of chaos, temptation, or weakness. Thinkers like Plato and Schopenhauer didn't ask how a woman experienced the world. They asked what she represented. And once she became a symbol, they no longer had to confront her as a living presence. That's the strategy. Make her an idea, and you never have to risk being changed by her. But here's the truth: what they feared wasn't her softness. It was her power to disrupt the illusion of order they had spent their entire lives constructing. It starts subtly. Women are spoken about endlessly, but rarely listened to. The feminine becomes background noise in rooms dominated by male voices claiming to speak for everyone. Her voice is reframed as emotion, her experience reduced to instinct, her intellect either ignored or labeled as exceptional, as if thinking were a deviation from her natural state. Even today, a woman who expresses certainty is seen as aggressive, while a man doing the same is seen as assertive. That's not coincidence. That's inheritance. Schopenhauer didn't call women incomplete by accident. He called them that with philosophical confidence. And in doing so, he gave generations permission to do the same. His words became the script. His tone became the standard. And his verdict became the default. Most people think this is just history, but it's not. It lives in how women still lower their voices in meetings, how they rehearse softness to be heard, how they shrink their vocabulary so they won't be labeled too much. The idea that women are less rational isn't a myth. It's a philosophy that was never dismantled. It was embedded. Freud didn't listen to women either. He translated their pain into theory. If she spoke of discomfort, it became hysteria. She didn't speak, it became repression. Her words were never accepted at face value. They were always filtered through a male framework. She wasn't allowed to define her experience. She was allowed to be studied silently, objectively, at a distance. That's not analysis. That's domination dressed up as reason. It wasn't just what they said, it was how they wrote. Cold, detached, clinical, as if clarity required the absence of feeling, as if emotion disqualified truth. And that's the danger. Because once we believe that logic only lives in stillness, we start distrusting anything alive, anything raw, anything female. Entire intellectual systems were built on this rejection. And those systems still shape our world. The classroom, the courtroom, the workplace. A calm man is wise. A calm woman is lucky. Man is passionate. A loud woman is unstable. These aren't opinions. They're reflections of old philosophy's wands that built their walls by keeping the feminine outside. Not because she lacked value, but because her value didn't fit the blueprint. What they feared wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The feminine didn't terrify them because it was unknown. terrified them because it mirrored something they had buried in themselves: vulnerability, intuition, chaos, all the things they had trained themselves to fear. But here's the paradox. The more they tried to suppress her, the more their systems collapsed without her. Jung saw it. He named the anima the feminine presence within every psyche. And he understood that what we exile within ourselves doesn't disappear. It returns. In dreams, in projections, breakdowns. The feminine they silenced kept showing up, not as a woman in the room, but as the voice they couldn't explain inside their own minds. There's a reason women are still asked to justify their feelings, while men are applauded for introspection. There's a reason empathy is seen as a feminine trait, and that's not a compliment. It's a boundary. A way to separate the emotional from the intellectual, the soft from the serious. Women are allowed to feel, but not to think from feeling. They're allowed to speak, but only if they fit the tone. That's not inclusion, that's conditional tolerance. And in that framework, the most brilliant female minds are often dismissed simply for sounding different. But maybe it's not their voices that are the problem. Maybe it's the ears that were trained never to listen. This isn't about rewriting history. It's about seeing the cost of ignoring half the human experience. Because when philosophy refused to hear the feminine, it didn't just silence women, it silenced parts of every soul. And what we refuse to hear, we can't integrate. That's why the most dangerous voices are the ones who don't beg to be included. They expose what the system tried to hide. And once it's exposed, it can't be unseen. That's where real change begins. Not with invitations, but with disruptions. With questions that don't go quiet. With truths that don't wait for permission. That's the energy that was never erased. It's just misnamed. She was never weak. She was never missing. She was just mistranslated. And now, her voice is returning. Not to ask for space, but to take it. To remind the world that intelligence is not the absence of feeling. That logic without empathy is control. And that a system built on silence will always collapse under the weight of its own denial. The feminine was never the threat. It was the mirror. And maybe that's what scared them most. If this reflection stirred something in you, tell me. What part of yourself was silenced to survive? Drop it in the comments. And before we move on, check the first pinned comment. I left something powerful for you there. You've probably heard their names, Plato, Schopenhauer, Freud. But have you ever asked who they left out? Behind every celebrated philosopher, there's a pattern not of ignorance, but of erasure. The feminine wasn't just avoided, it was written out. Not with malice, always, but with method. They didn't need to ban women from thought. They only needed to define truth in ways that excluded her voice. What they couldn't explain, they categorized. What didn't fit into their frameworks, they labeled irrational. And what challenged their systems, they transformed into metaphor. That's how you erase someone without touching her. You turn her into an object of meaning, never a subject with meaning of her own. Plato imagined an ideal world, one that began by stripping away the body. Desire, feeling, contradiction, all of it, discarded in pursuit of a perfect, rational order. In that world, there was no room for what moves, bleeds, or breaks. And since the feminine has always been linked to the body, it became an obstacle to be overcome. Schopenhauer took it further. He didn't veil his disdain, he declared it. He saw woman as a biological failure, incapable of reason, worthy of subordination. No mystery, no metaphor, no nuance. Just condemnation. And yet his voice echoed through generations, not as an extremist, but as a philosopher. That distinction gave his hatred weight. And once hatred wears the mask of intellect, it's harder to unlearn. Freud tried a different route. He didn't attack women, he dissected them, called their minds a dark continent, not to explore, but to explain away. He translated discomfort into disorder, silence into repression, anger into hysteria. He built entire theories not on what women felt, but on what he believed they lacked. A missing organ became a missing identity. And so, the feminine was reduced not to a voice, but to an absence. Freud didn't listen, he diagnosed. And that's the tragedy. His framework became the lens through which female experience was interpreted for decades. The more they spoke, the more misunderstood they became. Because the system was never designed to understand, it was designed to define. That's how philosophy works when power chooses the questions. The thinker controls the lens and therefore the conclusions. The feminine became a symbol of everything thought must overcome: chaos, fragility, emotion. Not a participant in knowledge, but a reminder of what must be suppressed to seem wise. And so every time a woman cried, doubted, contradicted, or softened, she didn't just challenge the room, she challenged the system. That's why women were rarely included as thinkers. It's not because they lacked ideas, but because their presence would have unraveled the architecture of control. The system didn't fear incompetence, it feared disruption. And the feminine, in its raw and unfiltered truth, is the definition of disruption. Even today, traces of this structure remain. Women are quoted less and interpreted more. Their stories are filtered through male narrators. Their insight is often framed as anecdotal, while male ideas are treated as universal. It's not always intentional. Sometimes it's atmospheric, but the result is the same. The feminine becomes credible only when it aligns with pre-approved tones. If she's too intense, she's unstable. Too quiet, she's passive. Too confident, she's difficult. There's always a price to sound real in a system that only trusts detachment. And that's why so many brilliant women have stayed silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew what their voice would cost them. But systems don't stay untouched forever. They fracture. And it didn't take permission. It took confrontation. Thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir, Luce Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva didn't enter the conversation quietly.
No.
They didn't ask for space, they exposed the walls.
Oh.
Beauvoir showed how woman was invented philosophically as the other. Irigaray revealed how language itself betrayed a masculine bias. Kristeva examined how what was repressed didn't disappear, returned, distorted, through resistance and breakdown. These weren't additions to philosophy, they were disruptions. And in doing so, they proved that knowledge built on exclusion isn't stable, it's afraid. Once something is named, it can no longer pretend to be natural. Once the feminine is spoken, as real, not just reflected, not just theorized, but present, the system can no longer protect its silence. That's what these women did. They didn't just bring new ideas, they brought new presence. Their voices didn't echo, they cut through. With every sentence, they made it harder for philosophy to remain clean, closed, and untouched. They reminded the world that intelligence isn't just clarity, it's complexity. That truth without contradiction is often just control in disguise. They didn't rewrite the system, they exposed what it feared most: contact. And that brings us to a deeper question. Entire systems of thought were built on what they excluded. What happens when those exclusions start to speak? Not symbolically, not quietly, but directly. What happens when women stop being metaphors and start being mirrors, reflecting the parts of ourselves we've spent centuries trying to suppress? That's where we go next. Into the mirror itself. Into the part of the feminine that refuses translation and, in doing so, threatens the illusion of order the system depends on. Before we step into that reflection, tell me, what story have you been told about your mind? And who wrote it for you? Share it in the comments. And don't forget to check the pinned comment for something that might help you see it differently. There's a haunting myth that echoes through history that women have been absent from philosophy, but absence is rarely real. It's constructed. She wasn't missing. She was misread, mistranslated, misnamed. She spoke, but the system didn't know how or didn't want to hear her. So instead of listening, it reframed her presence as silence. It's easier that way. If a woman doesn't fit the structure, you can claim she isn't there. That's the lie many of us inherited without question. That the feminine didn't think deeply, didn't create theory, didn't shape systems. But the truth is sharper. She was thinking. She was creating. Just not in the tone the system had approved. Jung came close to naming this fracture. He saw the feminine not as an external mystery, but as a psychic presence, the anima. Not weakness, but insight. Not irrationality, but a deeper knowing. He described her as intuition, creativity, feeling all, the qualities dismissed in the name of structure. Jung understood that what we exile internally doesn't vanish. It distorts. And when culture represses an entire mode of knowing, it doesn't just lose something, it begins to hallucinate. That's why the feminine often reappears in strange forms, in projection, in dreams, in rage, in breakdowns. The world keeps misinterpreting her, not because she is unclear, but because it refuses to learn her language. What if the real knowledge isn't in detachment, but in proximity? What if truth doesn't always arrive clean and quiet, but messy and full of contradiction? That's what the feminine brings, not as gender, but as experience, as rhythm, as rupture. It's the wisdom of someone who has felt everything and still chooses to speak. But to accept that kind of knowledge, we have to release the illusion of control. That's terrifying to systems built on stability. That's why even today, a woman's story is considered anecdotal, her pain personal, her insight emotional. It's as if those words make it less real. As if abstraction is the only form truth is allowed to take. But the deepest truths don't come clean. They come raw. They arrive in questions that don't resolve, in tears that have no theory, in contradictions that refuse to flatten. The feminine doesn't offer easy answers. She offers depth. And for a long time, depth was seen as danger. So instead of being embraced, it was managed, contained, turned into performance or pathology. That's why women were allowed to feel but not define, to suffer but not name their suffering, to express but not be believed. This wasn't just erasure. It was distortion. The cost wasn't just philosophical, it was personal. Every time her voice was reinterpreted, a part of her was lost. And yet she remained, quiet but not gone. Soft but not weak. Present, even when no one noticed. That's the power of the feminine waits, without disappearing. It survives misnaming, survives dismissal, survives theory. Because it never relied on permission to exist. It only needed space to be heard, and now that space is opening. Not because the system made room, but because she stopped waiting. Women today are no longer asking to be translated. They are rewriting the script in their own tongue. They are no longer adjusting their tone to be taken seriously. They are redefining what seriousness sounds like. And as that voice grows louder, the old frameworks begin to tremble. Because once she speaks on her own terms, you can't reduce her to metaphor. You can't turn her into an idea that's safe to handle. She becomes real, and realness is disruptive. She reminds us that clarity can coexist with contradiction. That logic is incomplete without feeling. That truth doesn't need to be perfect to be powerful. And most of all, that thinking doesn't belong to those who distance themselves from life, but to those who are willing to be changed by it. That is what the system feared all along. Not the feminine as weakness, but the feminine as mirror. Because once you look into that mirror, you see more than her. You see yourself, your hidden softness, your denied fears, your buried intuition. And maybe that's why they tried so hard to silence her. Not to control her, but to avoid meeting themselves. Because she never just reflected a woman. She reflected the parts of every human that didn't fit the system's mold. She was the voice inside that asked, what if you don't need to control everything to be wise? What if vulnerability is not a flaw but a doorway? What if your deepest truth can't be said with detachment? And maybe it's time, we answered her. Because the feminine doesn't come to confirm the system. She comes to undo it gently, radically, completely. Not to destroy, but to humanize. Not to argue, but to illuminate. She doesn't demand allegiance. She demands presence. And if we listen, really listen, she might show us a way of thinking that doesn't leave parts of us behind. Before we close this chapter, ask yourself, what part of your voice have you been translating just to survive?
House.
Leave your answer in the comments. And check the first pinned comment. I left something there to help you begin unlearning in your own language. What if knowledge didn't begin with answers, but with listening? Not listening to power, not listening to tradition, but listening to what was buried, ignored because it made too much noise in a world that called stillness truth. The feminine in philosophy was never just a subject. She was the test, the mirror, the quiet rebellion. Not because she wanted to destroy the system, but because she refused to disappear inside it. And now that she's speaking again, the system is out of excuses. You don't need to erase your softness to be taken seriously. You don't need to translate your pain into their language just to be heard. You don't need to be still to be wise. You are allowed to feel and know at the same time. You are allowed to contradict yourself and still be whole. That's what they never told you. So here's the invitation. Speak from where it hurts. Speak from where you were silenced. Speak even if your voice shakes, because silence doesn't make you strong, it only makes their system comfortable. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of your truth have you been softening just to survive? Tell me in the comments. That's where we continue this conversation, raw, real, and finally heard. And if you're ready to go deeper, check the first pinned comment. I've left something there that might help you reclaim what was once untranslatable. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because this isn't just a video. It's a voice returning.